artist, storyteller, tinkerer, and most of all, puppeteer. These are all words that describe Jim Henson. Born on September 24, 1936, and died on May 16, 1990, Jim Henson both enchanted and inspired millions of people worldwide with his out-of-the-box yarn spinning, experimental filmmaking, and groundbreaking puppetry. Throughout his youth, Jim Henson was always very artistic. There were three things that influenced his artistic interest. The first were the skills and talents of his grandmother, Dear, who had a knack for sewing, drawing, and painting, and would always encourage Jim's storytelling. The second influence consisted of both the films of his formative years like The Wizard of Oz and The Desert Hawk, as well as the books and comics of his youth like Pogo and the Wizard of Oz book series. And the last influences of his creativity were the radio shows and eventually the television shows of his youth. More specifically, television shows like Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, and the comedy stylings of ventriloquist Edgar Bergen on a radio show called The Chase and Sanborn Hour. His love for the art of television made him want to pursue a career in the field, and as he prepared to graduate from Northwestern High School for the University of Maryland, he did so with the intent to start a career in show business. His big break came early in his academic career when his local CBS affiliate, WTOP, held open auditions for young puppeteers. At this point in his life, puppetry was an art form that he had yet to master. But with a little help from his local library, he checked out The Puppet Theater Handbook by Marjorie Batchelder and My Profession by Sergei Vladimirovich Obraztsov, a puppeteer from Russia. With the help of his friend Russell Wall, the two auditioned by performing a sketch featuring a comic character of Jim's, Pierre the Rat, in puppet form. Their audition was a success, and Jim and Russell became part of WTOP's Junior Mornings show and later on Roy Meacham's Saturday show, though both shows were short-lived. Despite this, Jim never gave up on puppetry. During his first year at the University of Maryland, he switched his major from fine arts to home economics, which at the time was more art-heavy. His continued efforts ended up paying off as Jim ended up being discovered again by another network, WRC. From here he founded a puppeteer troupe known as the Muppets, alongside his future wife, Jane Nebel. During the Muppets' time on the network, they ended up creating their own short series called Sam and Friends, a variety-type show featuring a human-looking puppet and his variety pack of unusual friends. One of said friends would become immortal. That friend was a funny little green character named Kermit. At first, Kermit didn't look that much like a frog. As a matter of fact, some say he looked more like a lizard during his time on Sam and Friends. But Kermit was always a favorite of Jim's, especially due to the puppet's physical flexibility, which allowed for the character to have more expression in the face, a trait very uncommon in puppets. Kermit officially became a frog when Jim used the character as a minstrel in the failed pilot Tales of the Tinker-Dee. The frilled collar on the character's costume gave him a sort of froggishness that Jim embraced, leading Kermit to become the frog that we all know and love. Sam and Friends ran for 6 years on NBC, and during this time the Puppeteers in the Muppet family began to grow and change. Jim and Jane got married and began raising a family, which led to Jane's eventual departure from puppetry. Also, a fortuitous trip to a Puppeteers of America convention led to Jim and Jane finding more people to join their Muppet family. These new family members consisted of Jerry Jewell, Frank Oz, and later, following the show's end, Jerry Nelson and a puppet builder named Don Saline. Long after the literal explosive end of Sam and Friends, the stage was blown up in the last episode, Jim's puppetry continued in the form of commercials for Purina Dog Chow and TV spots for The Ed Sullivan Show. These and more featured colorful characters such as Rolf the dog, and some great stories and skits such as The Great Santa Claus Switch that was performed for The Ed Sullivan Show. His performances were so unique that they caught the attention of Joan Gans Cooney, who at the time was developing a new edutainment show called Sesame Street. Cooney wanted to try and change the face of television in this pre-cell phone and home computer era by proving that the new medium could be used as a teaching tool, especially for kids who did not have the luxury of a nearby library. Upon seeing Jim's commercials with their explosions, scary monsters, and interesting means of getting messages across, Cooney knew exactly who she needed to make puppets for her show, to the point that she even said, "If we can't get Jim Henson, we won't use any puppets at all." In the end, she got her wish. When the show first got started, the audience wasn't as universal as it is now. As a matter of fact, the original set looked a lot like a friendly neighborhood that had seen better days, so as to relate to the show's target audience. However, as more and more people began watching, the street, you might say, became gentrified. The same principles also appeared to apply to Jim Henson's Muppet characters if you compare skits and episodes from the earlier seasons to what we see on Sesame Street in the present. Back then, the Muppet characters were more prone to fits of anger, were more frightening to look at, and some characters like the Count were just plain selfish. But just like how people evolve and change, the Muppet characters, especially the monsters, became a little less scary looking and adopted a more friendly demeanor that allowed them to have more friends and more fans. And now the show's just celebrated its 50th anniversary. In spite of Sesame Street's success, Jim didn't want to limit himself to the child audience. He had tried featuring his characters on Saturday Night Live, but neither the human cast nor the felt-phobic SNL writers enjoyed working with Jim and his crew, as they felt that puppetry was beneath them. This led to the creation of The Muppet Show, for which he filmed 2 different pilots, The Muppet Valentine's Special and The Muppet Sex and Violence. Naturally, the pilots are quite different from the resulting show. For example, Kermit wasn't the host in either one of the pilots. The first pilot, The Muppet Valentine's Special, featured a humanoid puppet named Wally as the host. In the second pilot, The Muppet Sex and Violence, a character named Nigel hosted the show. Unfortunately, Nigel was not very charismatic, and when Kermit became the official host, they used Nigel's character to conduct the Muppet Orchestra. As for Wally, he was never seen again after that first pilot. But despite the pilot's imperfections, a lot of good things came out of them as well. For example, the Muppet Valentine's Special taught Jim how the show could benefit from having human guest stars for the puppets to work around. The project took Jim several years to sell before finally being picked up by Lord Lou Grade, a Russian-British producer of film, theater, and television. The show was produced in England and ended up becoming a global phenomenon that is still enjoyed in reruns today. Wanting to ever broaden his range, Jim Henson ended up producing 2 fantasy films following the success of the first Muppet movie. These new cinematic ventures were The Dark Crystal, released in 1982, and Labyrinth, released in 1986. These 2 films were produced simultaneously with Jim's other productions. The Dark Crystal was Jim's means of doing something else with his creative gifts that had nothing to do with the Muppet characters. Jim ended up being inspired by the works of Brian Froud, an artist whose specialty was fantasy pictures depicting environments so detailed and lifelike that everything from the forest to the mountains seemed sentient. In almost no time, a deal was made with Mr. Froude to create what Jim referred to as the great film. Blossoming from an outline that Jim and his daughter Cheryl concocted while snowed in at a hotel, as well as a film treatment from a story he'd abandoned called Mithra, Jim managed to pull together a treatment for what was then called the Crystal. During production, Jim poured his heart and soul into the creation of the world of what came to be called the Dark Crystal. This ended up being a difficult task as he was simultaneously working on production of another Henson show, Fraggle Rock, at the time. He ended up buying the Dark Crystal itself in order to keep his vision his own when it came to both the big picture and all the details involved. The film's distributors had a different idea of what was good. In the end, the film did well financially, making back over $40 million against a $15 million budget. Unfortunately, not all audiences enjoyed the film, mostly due to the fact that it bore Henson's name, but it wasn't a comedy and the Muppet characters weren't in it at all. But despite this, Jim still went on to create Labyrinth. Now, Jim had a general idea of a story for Labyrinth involving a jester and a king running through a labyrinth full of bizarre obstacles like an evil Buddha statue and other dangers. Later on, after being inspired by another one of Brian Froude's pictures, specifically of a baby surrounded by monsters, Jim and writer Dennis Lee ended up on the right track to the film's final form. Additional writing contributions came from Terry Jones, a member of the British acting troupe Monty Python, and an acclaimed children's book author. And the final jewels in the production crown were George Lucas producing and David Bowie playing the film's primary antagonist, Jareth the Goblin King. But if you thought that this film would be embraced more because of the people behind it, you would be incorrect. Labyrinth ended up being a box office disaster, with critic Roger Ebert only being able to praise the construction, production, and creativity of the film. And while that may not sound so bad, it didn't do the film as a whole much justice. In the present, both movies now have cult followings as well as several comic book sequels and prequels of varying mediums, such as the Netflix series The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, that was released in 2019. After his adventures with the two fantasy films, Jim began to focus more on television, and particularly on works like The Storyteller, The Jim Henson Hour, and The Muppet Babies. But despite him being mostly focused on television, Jim's company, Jim Henson's Creature Shop, continued to make major contributions to the film world by providing puppet characters for films The Witches and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In the late 80s, Jim Henson made the decision to sell his production company to Disney in order to allow himself to focus more on the creative aspect of his storytelling, while Disney took care of business matters. This was especially good for the Disney company at the time, as they too were going through a lot of financial difficulties and felt that the Muppet characters would help keep the company going. This deal ended up taking over 20 years to complete for a number of reasons. Number one, Disney couldn't have everything the company owned. Only the characters from the Muppet Show, save Kermit, who Jim wanted to be his and only his. Number two, Disney couldn't have the Sesame Street characters. But perhaps the biggest reason of all for the deal not going through right away was the fact that Jim Henson died of strep pneumonia in 1990 before anything could be finalized. In the present day, the Jim Henson Company continues to make new and unique works under the direction of Mr. Henson's kids. The Muppets went to Disney in 2004, and the Sesame Street characters, as of the year 2000, are now owned by the Sesame Workshop, formerly the Children's Television Workshop. And from what I have seen, I feel that Mr. Henson would be proud of both his legacy and what has become of it. Jim's vision and spirit lives on in the form of a green felt frog with ping-pong ball eyes.